Hi everyone, and welcome to Truth Over News. Two new and explosive stashes of COVID origin documents were released last week. One involving Fauci's organization, the National Institutes of Health, and the other involving the State Department, which was run by Mike Pompeo at the time. Now, we have covered previous explosive document dumps on this show, but the new ones aren't just more of the same. The new documents aren't so much pieces of the puzzle as they are huge smoking guns all on their own. The NIH emails prove that there was collusion at the highest levels to cover up the origin of the pandemic. Meanwhile, over at the State Department, officials were complaining at the start of the pandemic that if their own warnings about the Wuhan lab had been heeded, there wouldn't have been a pandemic at all. Yet no one said anything, and we had to wait for 3 years for these documents to be pried out of the hands of deep state bureaucrats. The new treasure chest of documents proves that deep state operatives at the State Department, as well as staff at the highest echelons of the National Institutes of Health, or NIH, including its director, knew that the pandemic started in the Wuhan lab and covered up this crucial information, which, if known, would have changed the course of the pandemic by totally refocusing the response. In a previous episode, we explained that if the public and lower-level public health officials had been aware that COVID had been pre-optimized for human transmission, thereby rendering the usual mitigation measures like contact tracing totally useless, well, then the entire pandemic response would have been different, and we wouldn't have seen the destruction of countless lives and livelihoods based on false premises. As it turns out, the fact that these premises were false was known not only to the highest health officials at the NIH, but also to officials at the State Department. Let's start with the NIH. A new batch of NIH documents was obtained by independent journalist Jimmy Tobias last week. Now, most of these documents had been released under previous Freedom of Information lawsuits, but NIH censors covered up all the juicy bits. That's always the problem with these Freedom of Information suits. The people who make the decisions to conceal stuff are the same people who have an incentive to conceal stuff. We know from an earlier Freedom of Information lawsuit that the longtime director of the NIH, Francis Collins, who we already knew was instrumental in covering up the origin of COVID, was personally vetting FOIA documents. In other words, NIH censors allowed the target of FOIA requests to cover up evidence of his own misdeeds. Well, Collins may have succeeded in previous FOIA rounds, but due to the dogged determination of FOIA warriors like Tobias, we now know what was hidden under the redactions of a previously released Collins email, and also why it was hidden. While the previously released email from Collins was almost entirely redacted, the newly unredacted email proves that the situation surrounding EcoHealth, which is the shady outlet through whom Collins and Fauci were funding gain-of-function experiments at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, well, that was causing a far bigger headache for both men than they let on. Publicly, they pretended to know nothing about the Wuhan lab, but privately, they knew a lot. As the new email shows, Collins emailed his predecessor at the NIH, a man called Harold Varmus. That was in August of 2020. Collins admitted that this EcoHealth grant and its connection to Wuhan was presenting one of the most difficult and wrenching situations in his 11 years as NIH director. Tellingly, Collins added that this topic was not appropriate for email. So it turns out that the previous version of this email wasn't redacted because of some legitimate reasons, but because Collins didn't want a paper trail of his lies and deceptions about the Wuhan lab. It's always the same. They use these FOIA redactions excuses to cover up their own misdeeds. But it gets worse. Collins also told Varmus that Tony, meaning Anthony Fauci, and Collins himself would like the chance to speak with Varmus about their private insights into what was going on at the Wuhan lab and why it was the worst thing that Collins had ever encountered in his 11 years as director. So, to be clear, this is incontrovertible proof of a conspiracy. We've of course talked about the cover-up many times before, but this is a real, tangible, documentary piece of evidence that Collins and Fauci were conspiring together to cover up the lab leak, which in this case meant that they needed to fill in Varmus, who had just started talking to the media about COVID's real origins. At the time, Varmus was a supporter of the natural origin narrative, but Collins and Fauci must have concluded that having the former director of the NIH out and about talking freely was not a risk they wanted to take, at least not without telling him what they knew and what could be said publicly. There's also the fact that Fauci wanted Varmus on the fake World Health Organization origin search team. His place ended up going to EcoHealth's Peter Daszak. Now, we don't know whether Varmus was upset that he didn't get on the WHO team, or whether he even knew that Fauci had tried to get him on the team, but it does show us once more how close-knit these people are. Perhaps most telling of all, in his email to Varmus, Collins shared a link to one of the first scientific articles to systematically lay out the case for a lab origin of COVID. This is remarkable for various reasons. First, there's the fact that Collins shared it at all. Second, Collins said he was sharing the article not because he completely agreed with it. So the inference is that he agreed with at least parts of it. Recall that we're talking about a scientific article that was one of the first to show that COVID likely came out of a Wuhan lab. And then, of course, there's also the fact that at the same time that Collins was sharing scientific evidence for a lab leak with his predecessor, he was telling the public that the virus was totally natural and that anyone who said otherwise was a conspiracy theorist. Well, it turns out that the conspiracy theory was true all along and that Collins knew that it was true. Let us now turn to the second new document release. The way FOIA works is you have to apply for, or if that doesn't work, you have to sue different agencies and groups. It's not a one-stop shop. Groups like US Right to Know are active all over the place, for instance, in getting documents from the NIH, from universities, from the Department of Education, from the Pentagon, and so on. The latest explosive batch is from the State Department, and it is stunning, perhaps even more stunning than the Collins email we just saw. In one of the new emails, which are from March of 2020, an unnamed State Department official forwarded a bunch of warnings about the Wuhan Institute of Virology to another unnamed State Department official. These warnings had originally been sent by the State Department to the National Security Council in 2018, and they were extremely explosive, warning, among other things, that the Wuhan lab had a serious shortage of appropriately trained technicians and investigators needed to safely operate this high containment lab. The 2018 cables also warned that the Wuhan lab's director, Shi Zhengli, whom we've covered on many previous shows, wanted to conduct her coronavirus experiments in much safer biosafety level 4 labs, but her request was allegedly denied by the National Health and Family Planning Commission, a state agency of the Chinese Communist Party. The cables also warned that Shi Zhengli was working with viruses that could infect humans. In sum, all the big red warning flags that were needed were there, but no one listened.